Buddy. So we ran a little bit short on time in class, and I didn't have time to give you the typical introduction to our next text that I usually do. So I wanted to just record a quick video and give you an overview of the two poets that you're going to be reading for next time. Remember, we don't have class on Wednesday because of Veterans Day. You will have your lecture on Thursday, which will be on Whitman and Dickinson, so you should try and get the reading done before Thursday. And then Monday, we'll have our first class and our only class on Whitman and Dickinson. Okay, so for next time, you're reading two of the most famous American poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. They are writing in roughly the same time period. They're both writing in the 19th century. Whitman lived from 1819 to 1892, and Dickinson from 1830 to 1886. So they're both writing around that kind of middle of the 19th century, kind of into the 1870s, like that period. Aside from the fact that they were writing around the same time, their poetry couldn't be any more different. We'll start with Whitman. So Whitman was bombastic. He was grandiose. His subject matter was everything. When you read Leaves of Grass, the piece that you're reading, you'll probably be overwhelmed on the way that it just careens from subject to subject, from topic to topic, from really things that would seem unrelated. It bounces from one to another. And many compare him to some of the ancient writers that we've encountered in that respect. Poets like Virgil or Dante or Homer, where seemingly the topic before them is just kind of the entirety of the human experience. Whitman wanted to capture it all. He wanted to convey it all. He wanted to weigh in on everything. The poem that you read, Leaves of Grass, is really a reflection upon 19th century America. And in many senses, it's this kind of exuberant celebration of it, both the good and the bad, right? Emily Dickinson, I think you'll find, is a little bit different. Emily Dickinson suffered with severe social anxiety. She did not go out and experience the world, and she didn't really want to. She was famed for introversion, for seclusion, and you can see that in her work with this kind of inward focus. Her poems are short and they're precise, and they're these kind of distillations, these ruminations on very specific subjects, usually with kind of undertones or overtones. So she would write about nature a lot, in particular flowers. And she imbued flowers with certain symbolism. So certain flowers represented death, and some represented life, and some represented love, and some represented obsession. So those sorts of things. A poem about nature that's really about something much larger than nature. That's what we see in Emily Dickinson. She also reflected upon solitude. This is somebody that spent a lot of their life basically as a shut-in, alone, and so she had time to think about that solitude, that being alone and reflecting the world through those lenses of being alone. And death comes up a lot. Some people describe her work as melancholy. Some people describe her work as kind of morbid in its preoccupation with death and not being alive anymore. So that's Emily Dickinson. Really couldn't be more different than Walt Whitman. There's nothing bombastic about it. There's nothing overstated about it. Some things to think about as you read these poems. The first is just try to get a handle on poetry as a form. There's a link on the electronic version of these reading questions. There's also a web address that you could type in. But if you go to Blackboard and you actually download the reading questions that I passed out in class, you can just click on the link, and it's a guide for how to think about poetry, how to approach poetry. I know poetry is one of those things that, like, music or art, some people say, oh, I just don't get it. I just don't understand what I'm supposed to be reading for. If you have that issue, if that's kind of, one of the things that that you encounter when you read poetry, then don't hesitate to go to that link. And I think it's kind of helpful as a guide of how do I read poetry. Poetry, I would say, is making very conscious decisions about the sounds that you're producing and the juxtaposition of words. And so if you're not going to drive your roommate crazy, or you're not going to make everyone at the library think you're crazy, then then read some of these poems aloud and think about the words. Think about how it sounds and why were certain words chosen. And if you encounter words or passages that seem kind of interesting, you don't think too much about why. Just note them and then go back to them. Say, okay, why did I like this collection of 3 or 4 words? Because there's always, in the poet, there's always a very conscious choice of words and juxtaposition of words. You have 2 really interesting poets for comparison. Whitman and Dickinson really couldn't be more different. So it enables you to see 2 very different styles of poet. And think about that. Think about why they're different. Think about which you prefer and why you prefer it. And lastly, think about what is the purpose of poetry. You've encountered a lot of different styles this semester. You've encountered music and art and philosophical treatises and plays and novels, and now you're coming to poetry, right? And so how is poetry different than other literary styles or other styles of text? What makes it unique? Try to think about that. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And like I said, try to give it some time and really grapple with it, particularly if you're somebody that has never found yourself appreciating poetry. Really try to give it a chance. We will pick up with this on Monday. As I said, on Thursday, you'll have your lecture on Dickinson and Whitman. If you're doing a paper on Marx, that will be due on Monday. And as always, your reflection on Marx will be due tomorrow, okay, Tuesday. So that's all for now. I'll either see you guys at lecture on Thursday or I will see you in class on Monday. Okay, thanks.